Negative gearing was in the headlines again this week after official documents revealed that Treasurer Scott Morrison was advised Labor's proposed overhaul would only have a modest impact on property values.
Now that's in direct contradiction to the government's claims that any changes to negative gearing would smash Australia's housing market. The ALP's plan to restrict the tax deduction, along with halving capital gains tax discount, was a major issue during the last election campaign. Well, to discuss this and the other big stories of the week, we're joined by Assistant Minister for Social Services and Disability, Jane Prentice from Brisbane, and in the studio here with us, Labor MP Emma Husar.
Morning.
Good morning. Welcome to you both. Thank you very much. All right, well, Emma, let's begin with this issue of negative gearing because, of course, as we mentioned, it was a big campaign item for the last election. We're seeing more revelations this week around the government's approach. Of course, we're also seeing more of what Labor thinks should be done. So just spell out for us where you think the issue is and how this will impact on housing affordability.
Well, of course, we've got a situation now where home ownership is at the lowest that it's been ever in the history of our country. We've got wealthy property investors and speculators buying up all of the stock that first-time owners or first-time buyers should really be taking up. We have the most generous tax concessions on property anywhere in the world, so it's not a surprise that people are using that loophole. It's quite lucrative, but our policy is to restrict that negative gearing on properties that are already in existence. We want to see people stimulate the housing market by using those tax concessions where we need it, which is in new housing stock. So when we took our policy to the last election, of course, it was, it was a little bit controversial. We let the Australian people, debate it. But we've got an extraordinary situation now where the government has actually hidden this information for the last 2 years from the Australian public and treated them like they're a bunch of mugs or they're not smart enough to make up their own mind, which is really quite disappointing. For a number of reasons, but most of all just how out of touch this government really actually is.
But can you understand the trepidation perhaps if you are a property investor, in particular as the government says not everyone who takes use of negative gearing is wealthy. There's quite a lot of middle class people who use it as a wealth creator. There is a fear that this will cut into rising house prices and people might not be too attracted to that.
I think that those people who are using it and have used it so far as a way of, providing for their retirement income, we've put grandfathering provisions in that policy, so those people won't be affected. We're not saying we're going to stop it, we're saying just direct it in the area that it needs to be directed into. Having such generous tax concessions for people, I think personally it's a form of middle class welfare. You've got someone that's renting, they're paying their tax, they're also paying more rent to a landlord. They're being double dipped on. So I think that it's a fair policy, and it will actually benefit 76% of Australian households, and that's an extraordinary number of people to make a positive impact on.
So Jane Prentice, has the federal coalition government and also the New South Wales Liberal government, where we're hearing that they've basically either been ignoring or misstating in terms of Treasury advice that's been given on the issue. Is the government just essentially ignoring the issue?
Well, no, they're not ignoring the issue. The reality is that report is 2 years old, and the report doesn't say it won't have an impact. The discussions around the amount of the impact. We need to realise that over 1 million Australians benefit from negative gearing. Over 2/3 of those, 67%, earn less than $80,000 a year. These are Australia's battlers, these are our hard workers, these are people trying to get ahead. These are the people who are going to be affected. Another 11% earn less than $100,000. They're not wealthy, they're not speculators. These are the people who will be impacted by Bill Shorten's $164 billion tax impost on this market, which is what he's proposing.
Do you accept the fact, to stop you there, Jane Prentice, that the government may have overstated the impact when it says things like smashing the housing market and things like that to describe Labor's policy?
Well, if Bill Shorten imposes a $164 billion tax on the property sector, it will smash it. And that's the problem we have. People need to understand what the impact will be. The slightest change to this sector really does have a major ripple effect. And it's terribly important that we support the mum and dad battlers out there who are trying to get ahead, who work hard, save their money and invest it in property. More than 2/3 of Australians invest their wealth in property in Australia, and we need to make sure that that market is stable so they can be confident of their investment and they can plan for their future and their children's future.
I think the only thing that's really been smashed out of all of this is actually the government's credibility. If you want to hide documents for 2 years and not provide them and not put them on the table, I think that's the only thing that's actually being smashed.
What about Jane Prentice's point there about stability? I mean, a lot of people have invested in housing because of these rules, and they expect them to stay there. When you fiddle around with these types of rule changes, aren't you damaging investor confidence?
Well, that's why we put the grandfathering provisions in there. We made sure that those people who had invested for those reasons and with that in mind, that those people were protected, that they could continue to do that for the lifetime of their property, and that their investment would continue to do exactly what they had planned for it to do. So I think the grandfathering provisions were a great part of the policy. I think, restricting it to only new homes was another, great part of the policy. And we're not saying that, Jane's quoted 85% of people that are at that lower income bracket. We're not saying they can't do it, just do it where we need it.
So, Jane, what then is the answer? Because we are seeing a situation where housing affordability, particularly for people trying to get into the market, it's clearly an issue. So how do we correct that?
Well, we're making some real changes that will benefit everyone, including tax incentives for young first homeowners to invest some of their superannuation in their home. We've given incentives to older people to downsize to free up some of the market available to people in sort of more of the established suburbs, and we're also looking at freeing up land so we can actually build more products. So the coalition government is actually delivering real change to actually facilitate people into new homeowners.
Ownership under our policy would actually increase by 5.5 percentage points. So if we're going to talk about actually making a real difference, well, 5.5% percentage points is a massive jump and puts us back where we were probably 20 or 30 years ago in terms of people actually able to buy and afford to own homes.
And I think that that figure comes from particularly the lower end, if you like, of the
exactly
income
right,
bracket. But also, as a corollary of that is accepting the fact that people who do own homes at the moment can and should prepare themselves under your policy for lower prices, and their investment will be damaged.
I think that the modelling has shown that it would have a slight impact on property prices, but that it wouldn't be significant.
All right, well, let's move along to another issue, which, of course, has been gaining ground around the world, and that's the hashtag #MeToo discussion that's been had. Of course, Jane Prentice, we've also had a spotlight cast on that with the Golden Globes Awards ceremony. Is this just a symbolic moment, do you think, or is there a game-changer moment happening here?
No, I think it is a societal change, as we do over generations. Things that were accepted 30 years ago, people are now standing up and speaking up about it not being acceptable. As David Morrison famously said, the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And we've got to make very sure that we don't accept the behaviour that it seems to be endemic throughout some sectors. We also need to be very careful, I believe, to make sure that we maintain the presumption of people to innocence until proven guilty. Trial by social media perhaps is not acceptable, but equally it has highlighted an issue, and no doubt good has come from it. But I think there needs to be a balance in it all.
We have seen some local examples of some of these allegations. We were speaking before about allegations only against Craig McLachlan. We've also heard, obviously, about Don Burke. Should people in Parliament begin to speak out about these sorts of issues, and other community leaders? Do we need to see a bigger movement here in Australia against these kind of activities?
Yes, well, I think politicians do tend to speak out. It's definitely gained more notoriety now it's on social media. I think it's important for management to take people seriously. It's a bit like the domestic violence situation, 10 years ago, when a woman would say, I've been, assaulted, and people are, I'm sure he didn't mean to. And I think that's the most important thing we can do, is say, we believe you, we hear you, and management should be doing something about it if it's reported to them.
And Emma, you've got, I hate to bring this up, but some deep personal experience with some of these issues at the extreme end. What are your thoughts on the situation here in Australia and around the world with some of these issues?
I think speaking up is always, favourable, and people being able to feel safe to do that. I think that there are a lot of men around the world that will probably be having a bit of a hard look at themselves in the mirror and potentially running back over a few scenarios where they probably have acted maybe inappropriately. The power imbalance and the power structures that we've come to know as women lead us into this space where we are more vulnerable. But I think the Me Too phenomena, or the hashtag that's been trending, is actually not just looking specifically at the abuse of power, but also looking about other things where we are disadvantaged. So the gender pay gap, women's representation in boards and in positions of power. So I think it's not just isolated to this one thing. I think actually that it is going to gain momentum for all the things that women have been fighting for far, far, far too long.
I mean, you look at Hollywood, it's a socially progressive industry where you would expect these things not to happen, where still you see men at the top of the large companies. Do you think that perhaps changing that gender issue at the very top of even progressive companies like in Hollywood would fix a lot of these issues?
Absolutely. If women aren't having a seat at the table with these discussions, then no one's there to call out or curb poor behaviour, no one's there to call out inappropriate actions, and no one's there to represent the voices of the other 50% of the population. So I think that it is incredibly important that we keep making those steps towards a gender equal society and culture wherever we are in the world. And I think that then we will see things like the Me Too campaign not needed.
Well, Jane, just pointing to one of the key moments, I think, of the Golden Globes Awards ceremony, which was Oprah Winfrey's acceptance speech for the Cecil B. DeMille Award for outstanding contribution to the world of entertainment. 3 standing ovations during that event. We've had people clamouring for her to put her hand up to run for the US president. So that does actually lead us to think about what is the correlation, I suppose, between this movement and the issues around people in power. When we consider that the current president is Donald Trump, who has something of a very interesting 12 months in the top job there. Do you think Oprah Winfrey should run for US president?
Well, it's a great thing about democracy, isn't it? Anyone can run, and of course Ronald Reagan was a very successful former president and former governor of California, so America definitely have a track record for attracting celebrities to the top job.
Could you ever see a day, Jane Prentice, here in Australia where we'd see a reality TV star up against a daytime talk show host for the top job in Parliament?
Look, nothing's impossible, and I think in Australia we're probably more prone to having sports stars take on jobs. You know, look at Rick Charlesworth transitioned from celebrity sports star to Member of Parliament. We've got Damien Drum, one of our great footballers there at the moment. I know in Queensland, if Jonathan Thurston ever wanted to run for anything, I'm sure he'd be elected.
Not sure which side he'd be running for, of course, though.
That wouldn't matter with JT.
But does it also point to that moment where we've also been talking about where populism in politics, Emma, has really, we've seen a surge in that, not just around the world, but also here in Australia?
I think that we have a situation where politicians are seen as out of touch and completely distorted from the reality of everyday life. I mean, you know, you've got a government hiding documents for 2 years. People want to see people in power who they can trust and who are like themselves. They want to see them reflected back, making decisions for their lives. So I think if Oprah ran for president, I think it's not about who she's, but about the morals and the values that she brings to that job. And diverse parliaments and with all kinds of interests represented are okay with me.
Well, it has been.
I always find it interesting. You sometimes get politicians who want to be celebrities. I mean, who can forget that great speech by Albo where he delivered the lines from the American president that time? So you sometimes see it in reverse as well.
Well, I think we probably need a comeback from you there, Emma. Not one side of politics only.
Oh, look, pop culture reference isn't my forte, but I think that we like to think of ourselves as being fairly in touch. I can give you a great Tay-Tay pop culture reference, or but look, I think politicians don't always seek to be celebrities. From time to time, you get a few that are a bit like that, but I think Albo's fine.
All right. Well, we look forward to the year ahead of us, not just the one that was. It's always great to have you both with us, Jane Prentice and Emma Hassar.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys, for having us.
Thanks very much. And